Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to today's video. I am extra excited about today's video because we are recreating the eyeshadow palette tag. This tag was created by two of my very favorite creators here on YouTube, Samantha March and Allie Glines. As a self-proclaimed eyeshadow palette junkie, I could not let this opportunity pass, so we are going to be talking all about my eyeshadow palettes today and how they fit into a variety of different categories. I of course will link Samantha and Allie's videos down below if you'd like to check those out. Before we get into the video, if you are new here, special welcome to you. I hope that you will consider subscribing to my channel, but we do have a lot of eyeshadow palettes to talk about, so let's get right into it. We're going to kick things off with the newest palette in my collection. It is the Anastasia Beverly Safari palette. I ended up picking up this palette recently when it was on sale for 50% off. I am not someone that goes and buys $129 eyeshadow palettes, but I love Anastasia Beverly, and I have always been really attracted to this eyeshadow palette color story. So one of you actually tagged me on Instagram letting me know that this was 50% off, and initially I thought, I can't do it. I don't need that palette in my life. I actually already have a palette that's supposed to be a dupe for this one. But I sat and thought about it all night long. In fact, in the middle of the night, I remember waking up and thinking, I wonder if the palette I own is a dupe for it. And there's really only one way to find out. So the next morning when I woke up, I thought, okay, I'm going to see if it's still on sale. It said one day only the day before. So I checked at 7 in the morning and it was still on sale. So I went ahead and hit the buy button. I'm normally a little bit more methodical about buying things, but this one I just couldn't pass up. I just love Anastasia Beverly's mattes, especially. This is an all matte palette and the colors in here are so beautiful. There's enough neutrals but also enough color in here that it gives me everything that I want when it comes to mattes. So I am planning to do a video on this one and the dupe palette that I have for it, which is the Folklore Impressionism palette. But there's another palette out there that is a supposed dupe for this one from C Color Cosmetics. I want to pick that one up as well and really give you guys my thoughts on if this palette is duped by those palettes. I will already tell you I wouldn't call the Impressionism palette a dupe for this one. There's actually quite a few differences between the two. We'll get into that in another video. We have way too much to talk about today. I would never have picked it up for full price, but considering the deal that I got, I think it's worth it for me. I am wearing this palette on my eyes today, not on my lid. I have something else that we'll talk about in a minute, but I am wearing these two shades right here, kind of in the outer part of my lid and my crease. So this is it for my newest palette, and I have to say, I am pretty excited to have this guy. For the oldest palette in my collection, I had to dig out this little guy right here. How many of you guys remember the original Comfort Zone from Wet n Wild? If you've been watching YouTube videos for 10 years, you'll probably remember when this thing was raved about. I was so excited the day that I found this in store because I had heard so many people raving about how these shadows were as high quality as some of their favorite shadows from MAC or from Makeup Geek. This is back in the day when really all that existed was MAC and Makeup Geek. There weren't a lot of palettes out there, and there certainly weren't a lot of great palettes at the drugstore. The formula of this is really nice. I know they have reformulated this and repackaged this. I haven't tried the newer one. The only reason I hold on to this one is really for sentimental value. This just brings back so many good memories for me. I remember getting this palette and trying out these shades and just being so excited to have such an affordable palette that was such great quality. It really is a great one, even though I don't use it anymore. On to my most expensive palette. Let's jump back over to the Anastasia Beverly Safari palette. This one, at its full price, is by far and away the most expensive palette I have in my collection. But even at the discounted 50% off price that I paid for, this is still the most expensive palette in my collection. Followed very closely by her 15-pan smaller palettes, like the Sunrise palette and the Love palette. I hate to say never, but I feel pretty confident that I would not buy this palette at full price. Who am I, right? As someone that complains about value of makeup products all the time, I feel kind of ridiculous that I bought this, but it really was a great deal, and this is just one of the palettes of hers that I've always really been drawn to, so I'm happy to have it in my collection. Expensive? Absolutely, but I know I'll get a lot of use out of this thing. And to the very opposite end of the spectrum, my most affordable palette is probably the same one that everyone seems to be mentioning, the e.l.f. Bite-Sized palettes. I don't know that there will ever be a makeup brand that can beat these palettes when it comes to affordability. $3 for 4 shades in pretty good formulas and pretty good color stories. I just don't know how they did that. I think that is amazing. I really enjoy these palettes, but I don't think they're the best formula out there. I've heard a lot of people say they think the formula in these compares with some very high-end eyeshadow formulas. I don't quite agree with that. There's a couple of the darker shades in some of these palettes that give me a little bit of trouble, that are a little bit patchy and difficult for me to blend, but considering the price tag, I don't like to be too picky with them. I think they're really great. You definitely can get them to work. I have mentioned a few times that I think you need a couple of these palettes to get a very complete look. If you don't want something that's too deep, there's quite a few of these palettes that I feel like are missing a lighter shade, but for $3 you definitely are getting way more than what you're paying for. So while I won't totally agree that these are high-end quality, I think they're great quality for the price. Next category is everyday palette. This one was tricky because I have quite a few palettes I consider to be kind of an everyday palette, but after really thinking about it, had to go with the Going Coconuts palette from ColourPop. This is definitely one of the few palettes that I will reach for when I really am in a rush. I don't want to think about what I'm putting on my eyes and I just need something I know is going to work. This is the perfect palette for that. You get everything you would need to create just a very simple everyday kind of look. I love the tones inside here. They're very soft, they're very neutral. They're not too warm, but they're also not too cool. The mattes inside here blend really easily. You get a good amount of depth, but you get plenty of shades to pop on your lid if you want something a little bit more bright there. I just love this palette, and I think for the everyday kind of look makeup lover, this is just such a well done palette, and definitely one that I reach for an everyday look. Now for the most colorful palette in my collection, that would have to be the Riviera palette by Anastasia Beverly Hills. This palette is a very colorful palette that is quite far out of my comfort zone, but I actually really love this palette, and I love having this palette for those times when I want to pull something in that is very, very bold and colorful. That doesn't happen super often, and there are a couple of shades in here that for me are shades I probably would never reach into, specifically this very bold pink in the middle. It's just too bold for me, but once I take that out, I would definitely wear a lot of these colors in here in combination with other neutral colors. Now, I don't know that I would call this my favorite colorful palette because I think that prize would go to the Magic Mini palette by Juvia's Place, but this one definitely has the most bold colors in it. Now, I do not reach into this palette super often, but one of the biggest reasons I keep this palette around is actually for 3 specific shades, and it would be these 3 right here. I love these 2 blues together. I don't often put blues on my eyes, but when I'm in that blue kind of mood, these 2 shades are my favorite blues that I own. They work beautifully together. I love popping this one on the outer half of the lid, this one on the inner half of the lid with a little bit of this white underneath in the inner corner. And this white right here it's like white paint. This is amazing, not on its own, but to transform other shades. I love putting this underneath another shimmer to give it a little bit more pop. I love mixing this into other matte shades to make them a little bit more light in tone. This shade right here gives this palette a lot more versatility for someone like me that doesn't want this type of a color on their eyes. I have done a 7 looks video on this. If you really want to dig back into my 7 looks playlist, you'll find this 7 looks video if you ever need some ideas on how to use color in a somewhat natural way. And one other slightly more ridiculous reason that I keep this thing around is for the packaging. I'm a big fan of navy blue and white in anything nautical, which is kind of funny because I'm actually wearing a navy blue and white striped shirt today. That was not intentional. I just love nautical things. So this is like my favorite packaging of all the palettes that I own. Moving on to the smallest palette in my collection, that would have to be the Mini Retro palette by Natasha Denona. This palette is very, very tiny. It's almost so tiny that I might be annoyed, other than the fact that it's Natasha Denona. The packaging is super cute, and I love the shades inside here. These are very much me shades. I love a good peachy eye. I love a good green that's not really green. And I do love how these shadows perform. I haven't had this super long, and I actually have not used it for the last couple weeks because it is so small. If it gets misplaced, if it's not sitting front and center, I'm gonna forget about this thing. But I do think it's a beautiful little palette. I love the packaging of this. It is plastic packaging, but for it being plastic, this feels very high-end to me. It's very sturdy feeling. The hinge feels nice. And honestly, $25 for 5 tiny little shades, it better feel nice, right? But I love this tiny little guy. I think someday when we're all traveling again, this will definitely be a contender for a traveling palette for me. And even though it was pricey for what it is, I really do enjoy this one. Let's move on to the biggest palette in my collection, and that has to go to the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette. I was very late to the game in picking this palette up. I think I picked this up last summer, so I've had this for almost a year now. But believe it or not, I have rarely used this palette. It looks completely brand new. I've only dipped into it a few times. I actually bought this palette with the purpose of doing a 7 looks video on it. For today, all I can tell you guys is that this is the largest palette that I own. I can't even say that I've used this very thoroughly yet. Haven't got to know it very well. I know there are a lot of people that own this. There are a lot of people that love it. I did just recently ask you guys which palette you most wanted to see me create a 7 looks video with. This came in second place next to the Sydney Grace palette. I'm hoping to get that done in the next couple of months, but I do want to say this. I have heard that they have changed the formula of this palette. So the one that they currently sell in store is not the exact formula as this original palette, but I wanted to let you guys know that. Jen Loves Reviews did a thorough video on how the 2 palettes compared. She tested them side by side. I will link that video for you guys down below just in case you are curious about that. But yeah, this is the largest palette in my collection. One of the things I really don't like about these Morphe large palettes is there are so many shades inside here, but I feel like so many of these could be taken out. So I can see like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 shades that on the eye would probably look pretty much identical. And it's not just with those shades, there are other shades that I see some similarities between. I just feel like there's a lot of redundancy in not just this palette, but really in all of Morphe's larger palettes, which is one of the reasons I don't really love them. I'm not opposed to a big palette, but if I'm gonna get this many shades inside a palette, I want maximum versatility. And I just don't know that you get that kind of versatility with this palette, considering there are so many shades. So that's just kind of my thoughts on this one. Haven't used it a lot. Really, all I can tell you guys is this is the largest palette in my collection, and that's kind of where my thoughts end. I don't dislike it, but I haven't necessarily used it enough to really love it. Next category is the best memory in an eyeshadow palette. I love this category. I have a lot of really fond memories attached to my eyeshadow palettes, which might sound crazy to some of you, but to others, it's probably the most understandable thing in the world. And probably one of my best memories from an eyeshadow palette is the Urban Decay Naked palette. There are so many reasons that this one falls into this category for me. This was my very first high-end eyeshadow palette. It was a gift to me from my sister that I so appreciated. And even more than that, this is just like such an OG eyeshadow palette. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this is kind of the palette that started the whole eyeshadow palette craze in the first place, that is continuing to this day. If you have been watching YouTube beauty videos since 2010 or earlier, as I have, I am sure that you will remember how much this palette was talked about and hyped up here on YouTube. And you might also remember that before this palette came out, people really just talked about their individual MAC shadows and their individual Makeup Geek shadows. And then this thing came along and kind of changed the whole world. You might be wondering to yourself, why does it look like you've never touched this thing? Probably the biggest reason for that is when I got this, it was so special to me that I would save this for special occasions. And as a mom of 3 young kids at the time, I really didn't have that many special occasions in my life. So this was like my Christmas party palette. That was pretty much it. Or my date night palette. And there weren't a whole lot of those happening at that time in my life either. So this was just not a palette that I used all that often. I wish I would have used it more. I think it's kind of a shame that I didn't get as much use out of this as I should have. And I've since learned my lesson. I've learned not to be so stingy with my really nice eyeshadow palettes, but I will forever hold on to this palette for all of those reasons. It has so many good memories for me. It reminds me of old school YouTube. And I felt so special, like I was a part of something big when I got this. So this will forever be a special palette to me, even though I'm not really using it. Next up is a palette that I think was worth the hype. I actually have a lot of palettes in my collection that I would say I think were worth the hype. I love a lot of my eyeshadow palettes, but one that I think got a lot of hype, and I absolutely agree with all the hype that it got, was the Sultry palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills. I think this palette is absolutely beautiful. I love this palette so very much. Anastasia is one of my favorite eyeshadow brands. I love her formula so much because it's really easy to work with, it's easy to blend, and you can get an eye look out of her palette so quickly because they are so pigmented but also easy to work with. I almost put the Soft Glam palette in this category because that one I also think is worth the hype, but the reason I went with this one instead is because I feel like this color story is actually, even though it looks very simple and basic, it's pretty unique. There's not a lot of cool tone palettes out there, and in my opinion, this is such a perfectly done cool tone palette. I have heard so many people say that when this thing came out. So many people were raving about it. I saw it in so many different favorites videos or year-end favorites videos, and I totally agree. This is the palette that I reach for when I really want something glamorous. I'm just a huge fan of this one. I think it was a big mistake for Anastasia not to make this a permanent eyeshadow palette. I don't think that you can really find this anymore. But I will say this, if you missed out on this palette and you're maybe regretting that you didn't pick this one up, I have heard that the dupes from Alter Ego and also from C Color Cosmetics are really good for this one, so I will link those down below. And as basic as it seems, I think the color story is really special. Next up, the palette that is not worth the hype. This one pains me a little bit, but I have to go with the Natasha Denona Love palette. It might be arguable whether or not this was really a hyped up palette. I'm going to contend that it was, just because this was only her second 15 pan smaller, slightly more affordable eyeshadow palette. And I know a lot of people out there, including myself, are really excited to see her continue this smaller, more affordable size. But the reason I don't think this was worth the hype for me personally was the color story. Now this is something I don't fault Natasha Denona for at all. This is a color story I should have looked at and realized there are no neutral colors in here. It might be difficult for me to get a full eye look out of this color story, and I did find that to be the case. Most of the mattes inside this palette, with the exception of these kind of darker mattes right here, have a very strong pink undertone to them, and not a soft, neutral, blush tone pink, but a very strong, bold pink. And I am just not into bold pinks. Looking at this palette, it doesn't look quite as bold as it actually looks on my eyes. Now, I'm not opposed to pink. I can get even a bold pink to work for me if I have neutrals to pair along with it. This is definitely one of those palettes that I should have waited on. I should have waited to see what other people were saying about it, see other people swatch it and talk about it, because I think I would have talked myself out of this purchase. If you are into bold pinks and purples, I think you'll probably love this palette, but it's just not really a color story that was me. And for the price that I paid for it, it's very sad that I don't use this as much as I feel like I should. Let's move on to my favorite palette from my favorite brand. Now, this is a tricky category because I have favorite palettes that may not necessarily be from my favorite brand in general. For a brand to be considered my favorite, I have to own a lot of their palettes. Anytime they come out with a new palette, it always excites me whether I buy it or not. And there's only a handful of brands that actually fit into that category for me. But above all of them would have to be Juvia's Place. I love Juvia's Place eyeshadow palettes for so many reasons. They're affordable, their packaging is adorable, their formula is really great, but more than anything, their color stories are so fun and interesting. But of all the palettes that I love, my very favorite has to go to the Nomad palette. I have talked this thing to death over the last 6 months on my channel. It dethroned my Nubian 2 palette at the #1 spot. I do still love that palette, by the way. But this one is just so special to me. I love this color story. I'm a huge fan of green shades that aren't really green. And that's exactly what these are. They're not brown, but they're not green, but they're also not gray. They're just really, really unique shades to work into an eye look. They're also so beautiful and flattering on the eyes. You get some bold color in here as well, along with some really good basic neutrals. But above all, the reason I absolutely love this palette so much is for this one shade in the middle. My favorite lid shade in my entire collection. This is the lid shade that I'm wearing on my eyes today. It is so beautiful. I've raved about it 1,000 times. If you've seen my other videos, you are probably sick of me talking about it. I love this shade. It is the perfect mix between a champagne and a gold. It's brightening, but it's not so warm and brassy like a lot of the golds I own to where it wouldn't go with anything. I already have a pretty massive dip in this center shade, and this is one of the few palettes that when I run out of this shade, I will have no hesitation repurchasing this entire palette because I just can't live without it. It definitely has to be my favorite palette from my favorite brand. We're down to the last category, and that is my most used palette. And that would have to go to the Persona Original Identity palette. This palette is just the most perfect palette in my opinion, and I reach for this thing all the time. I've been using this pretty regularly for the last couple of years since I first got it. On first glance, it looks like a pretty basic palette, but you get a lot of versatility in here. You get a little bit of warm, you get a little bit of cool, you get a little bit of neutral, a little bit of color, and the texture and formula of this I just don't think can be beat. The Persona formula is probably one of, if not my very favorite formula that I've ever worked with. I love these shimmers inside here. They are very reflective, very intense, but for the amount of reflectiveness they give, they don't emphasize texture in the way that a lot of my other very reflective shadows do. They look really smooth and flattering on the lids. And I love that I can use this palette to create something very neutral and soft and everyday, but if I really want to deepen things up and go really smoky, I can definitely do that. This is just such a well done palette. Anytime I travel, this is like my no thought, grab every single time, take it with me, because I know that I can get anything out of this palette. So Persona Identity, my most used palette. Can you see how very messy this thing is? Very, very well loved. And that, my friends, is it for the eyeshadow palette tag. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I had so much fun going through my collection, and I was surprised at how easy it was to come up with a selection for each of these categories. I know my own personal collection pretty well, and this was just such a fun video to kind of go through and reminisce on things and think about what I love for different reasons. But that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you are new here, one more reminder to subscribe before you leave, and I will see all of you in my next video. Bye. I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing. I can't say fighting the sun today. It's going in and out of the clouds, which always makes filming a nightmare. We're just gonna go with it.